This is the Justicefighter Podcast. Justicefighter Podcast. With Attorney Gerald Griggs. Attorney G. Where we have conversations on social justice, civil rights, and political news that affects us all. Let Attorney Griggs put you on game. Only on the Justicefighter Podcast, y'all.
What's going on, y'all? It's Attorney Gerald Griggs, a Justice Fighter, and we are back on the Justicefighter Podcast. And guys, it's been a while since I've been on the Justicefighter Podcast, and a lot of things have happened since the last time we talked. Guess what? I've been the president of the Georgia NAACP for almost 2 years now. The last time we were on talking about my candidacy for president of the Georgia State Conference, and I was successful enough to get elected, not once but twice. And so we are now journeying into justice. So the last podcast was 2022. It's 2024, and a lot has happened. We are transitioning into a new presidential election. We are dealing with redistricting. We are addressing criminal justice reform, but we're also dealing with a record number of police-involved shootings in this country and in this state. So it was time to come back on the Justicefighter Podcast to talk about things that are important to our community, for us to have a real conversation about what change really looks like and how you can get involved. So first and foremost, if you're not involved in the justice movement, you need to join an organization. You really cannot do this work in a vacuum alone. Secondly, you need to use your voice. You need to amplify your voice. You need to use your platforms to join the movement, because this is not going to happen alone. No one's coming to save us. So it's time for us to save us. And so that's another reason why I want to relaunch the podcast, because we need to have a platform where we can discuss what's happening in our community, how we can solve those issues, and then how we can push the conversation both in the state of Georgia, nationally in the United States, and then internationally, as we are engaging so many other issues that are germane not only in this country but around the world. So again, a lot has happened since the last time we were on this podcast. Again, I've been elected twice the president of the Georgia State Conference. We've gone through 2 years. The pandemic is still raging, but we're not getting as much information about coronavirus, COVID-19. And we have a full-fledged presidential campaign going in full tilt. And so what does that mean? That means that we have to be able to engage. We have to be able to have a real conversation. There's an attack on all things diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's an attack on the teaching of accurate history, both from an American perspective, but more importantly, from a Black perspective. And so it's important that we have this conversation. Since the last time we talked, the former president of the United States is not only running for re-election, but he's also facing 4 different cases, 91 charges, and to have the question answered once and for all in a court of law, what happened on January the 6th, whether it's an insurrection, whether someone will be held accountable, and whether there was election interference by the former president. So those are things that are happening right now. Voter suppression and attempts to suppress the voices of millions of Americans is continuing to happen, especially here in the state of Georgia. They passed SB 202, which is the voter suppression bill. Their redistrict, which now was challenged and forced to redraw the lines, and now there's a new majority African-American district. But we still have to talk about these things that are attempting to roll back the time that we are in. And so with these new platforms, we have to engage ourselves in a real serious discourse, because, many times in mainstream media, they gloss over what's really happening in real time. There have been several more police-involved cases, like the Nigel Cullins case, like the Deacon Johnny Holloman case. There have been trials that have occurred, like Hannah Payne's case, where she was held accountable for the killing of Mr. Kenneth Herring. And so I want to, get on here and kind of talk about these things in real time. And that's what we're going to do in the new iteration and the renewed energy in the Justicefighter podcast, so we can talk about it. So today we're going to talk about the Hannah Payne case and Kenneth Herring. And so you guys remember that incident occurred in 2019 before the pandemic, and it was egregious. It was a situation that happened in Clayton County, Georgia. An elderly gentleman who was in his 60s was involved in a minor car accident where he had a car accident with another car, and he waited for about 20 minutes until law enforcement was supposed to arrive. But before law enforcement arrived, there was a medical emergency where Mr. Herring was having a medical emergency, and he decided, after waiting for law enforcement, to drive off. And so there was several bystanders there, individuals, very busy area in Clayton County, which is in Georgia, here in Georgia. And so when he drove off, there was a bystander who was not even involved in the accident who decided to follow him. And so in following him, she attempted to cut him off, and then attempted to, I guess, perform a citizen's arrest or some sort of situation that was not really called for. She did make contact with law enforcement through 911, and 911 told her to cease the chase, but she continued with the chase and ultimately boxed him in and, blocked him in, and then approached the vehicle. And so the witnesses during the trial testified to this, and for the first time in the time that we have been advocating, by we I mean the Clayton County NAACP in partnership with the Georgia State Conference of the NAACP, found out that there were actual videos of the interaction between Hannah Payne and Mr. Herring that we got to see in live full color. And in full color, you saw Hannah Payne approach Mr. Herring, bang on the window, produce a gun, ultimately struggle and fight with Mr. Herring, as described by one of the witnesses who testified, and then step back and fire a shot. And so everybody got to watch the live stream of the court appearance and court case. It was carried on Law and Crime and also on Court TV. And so you saw it in real time, and it was just as shocking in real time to think about what happened to Mr. Herring. But it was even more shocking to see the attempt to victimize the victim in real time. And so the defense that was put up by Ms. Payne and her attorney was that Mr. Herring was the aggressor in this incident and ultimately tried to wrestle the gun away from Ms. Payne, and she had to struggle with the gun, and he pulled the trigger, is the defense. So the jury heard this. They also heard from the witnesses, but they got to see the video. And I think the video is the most telling piece of evidence in this case that people need to go back and watch. I placed it on my social media. But you see in the video, there appeared to be a struggle. Then the struggle ended. Ms. Payne stepped back and then fired into the vehicle and then didn't look after Mr. Herring at all, but commenced to bend down and pick up what appeared to be the shell casings in this case. And so I think that's what the jury ultimately saw, and that's why the jury came back with a guilty verdict on all counts, is because there was no way that Mr. Herring was the person that was the aggressor. He wasn't the person that chased anybody down. He wasn't the person that beat on the glass that appeared in the truck, and he wasn't the person that pulled the gun and fired the gun. And so I think that, as we continue to have these conversations about what justice looks like and what social justice is all about, it's cases like that but for video, but for the engagement of people, but for the virility of this case, there may not have been justice. And, the case that it reminded me of was the case that happened after Kenneth Herring's case in Georgia, and that was Ahmaud Arbery's case down in Brunswick. But this case happened before that. And so it wasn't until the renewed attention in this case because of podcasters, because of YouTubers, because of YouTube and the live stream of the incident, because of individuals who amplified the case, that being Amanda Seals and others who lended their platform to talk about what was happening. I don't know if the Herring family would have had justice, because there was the eye of the world in this case. But I think that amplifies what new media is about, what the Justicefighter Podcast is about, what social justice organizations like the NAACP and others are all about. And so I want this to be, kind of a teachable moment, that we have to convene. We have to make sure that we are watching, we have to make sure that justice is just. And so the moral of the story in Kenneth Herring and ultimately the accountability that his family got was they never took their eye off of what they wanted. And so my hat is off to them. My hat goes off to the Clayton County District Attorney's Office, who fought for almost 5 years to bring this case to trial and to make sure the truth was told in this case. But I also think it's important for listeners who listen to this podcast and others to realize the power that we have now in social media, that you can make sure that people's voices are heard in real time. And so that's one of the reasons why I want to come back to you with the Justicefighter Podcast and amplify the call for justice. But not just that. I told you in the beginning of the podcast that we need to be more engaged. We need to be more informed. And so with that, we are launching a new podcast. And this podcast is the podcast, the voice of the Georgia State Conference of the NAACP. Because all the time I get the same question: what's the NAACP doing? How do we get involved? Why are they just resting on the laurels about things that they've done in the past? And of course, the NAACP is not resting on its laurels, but we have to do a better job of putting our messaging out there, putting our events out there. And so we're going to be bringing you the NAACP's podcast, which will amplify the call for justice, but it would also amplify the work that's being done on the ground every single day in communities across the state of Georgia. So I'm happy to announce, and you will be able to get it where all podcasts are streamed and shared. It's the NAACP podcast, all things civil rights and social justice in Georgia. Stay on the lookout for that, because you will not only be able to hear from the presidents of the local units and from the youth councils and from all of the individuals that do work in the committees, but you'll hear directly from them what's happening in real time in Georgia and around the country as well, but mainly Georgia, what's happening in real time. And I want to open that platform up. So make sure you subscribe to that, the Georgia NAACP podcast, on all streaming platforms. But again, we're coming back strong with the Justicefighter Podcast. And I look forward to engaging with you in 2024 and beyond, because it's time for more justice. It's time for more accountability. It's time for more of the Justicefighter Podcast. I'm Attorney Gerald Griggs, the Justicefighter. I look forward to talking with you on the next episode of the Justicefighter Podcast.
This is the Justicefighter Podcast. Justicefighter Podcast with Attorney Gerald Griggs. Attorney G. Where we have conversations on social justice, civil rights, and political news that affects us all. Let Attorney Griggs put you on game. Only on the Justicefighter Podcast, y'all.